Then, early in 1943, he was taken prisoner by the German army at the Battle of Kharkov in Ukraine. In 1944, now in German uniform, he was sent to France to serve with an Ostbataillon, supposedly boosting the strength of the Atlantic Wall at the base of the Cotentin Peninsula, inland from Utah Beach. After time in a prison camp in Britain, he went to the United States, where he said nothing of his past. He settled there and finally died in Illinois in 1992, in a war which killed more than 60 million people and had stretched around the globe. This reluctant veteran of the Japanese, Soviet, and German armies had been comparatively fortunate. Yet Young remains perhaps the most striking illustration of the helplessness of most ordinary mortals in the face of what appeared to be overwhelming historical forces. Even after so many years of work on the subject of the Second World War, historians are still overawed by its scope, by its size, and by its consequences. It was almost certainly the greatest human tragedy ever known. The conflict stretched from the North Atlantic to the South Pacific, from the snowfields of Norway and Finland to the Libyan desert, from jungle fighting in Burma and on the islands and atolls of the Pacific Rim to the massacres by SS Einsatzgruppen on the borderlands of Central Europe. For those involved in the fighting on one side of the world, battles on the other side could have been taking place on another planet. And when it came to the unspeakable horrors of the Sino-Japanese War, they could have been taking place in the dark ages when marauding hordes terrorized peaceful populations into submission with conspicuous cruelty. To imagine all this after more than 70 years or 75 years of peace in Europe is indeed difficult. But although it seems a long time ago, the Second World War still affects politics and international relations. Today, it's very hard to appreciate the huge historical forces which killed those 60 to 70 million people. The Poles lost 6 million people, almost a fifth of their population. The Chinese lost more than 20 million. Estimates of Soviet losses now range from 24 to 26 million dead. Stalin knew in 1945 that they exceeded 20 million, but he tried to conceal this. As David Reynolds, the professor of international relations at Cambridge, pointed out, he settled for 7.5 million as a figure which sounded suitably heroic, but not criminally homicidal. Experiences and memories of the Second World War are so different that it's not surprising that each country has their own historical version of events. For Americans, the war started in December 1941, when Hitler declared war on the United States. Russians believed it had only begun in June 1941, when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. Most Europeans, on the other hand, consider that it commenced in Poland in 1939. But for the Chinese, it started in 1937, with the Sino-Japanese War. And many in Spain are still convinced that it began in 1936, with General Franco's nationalist rising to overthrow the Spanish Republic. Historians often extend the conflict even further, arguing over what is known as the Long War of the 20th century. Some say that it lasted from 1914 to 1945, including, of course, the Spanish Civil War. Others extend the period until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1990. The statistics of suffering and the sheer size of the numbers are dangerously numbing, as the Soviet Jewish writer Vasily Grossman instinctively understood. In his view, the duty of survivors was to try to recognize the millions of ghosts from the mass graves as individuals, not as nameless people in caricatured categories, because that sort of dehumanization was precisely what the perpetrators had sought to achieve. But focusing entirely on the dead makes us overlook the way the Second World War also totally changed or marked the whole life of survivors. It is vital that we understand the effect on the individual as well as on the statistical mass. A few years ago, I heard from a German friend that her sister's father-in-law had just died. His most intense childhood memory came from January 1945 in East Prussia, when he was only 5 or 6 years old. To escape the indiscriminate vengeance of the Red Army, his mother took him and his little sister on foot across the frozen lagoon of the Frischershaff. The ice began breaking up all around, with many people falling through to freeze and drown. Almost 75 years later, his last words, just before he died, were, "I can hear the cracking of the ice." In the mad scheme of such a war, human life was intensely fragile. Survival was totally unpredictable. In the Archives Nationales in Paris, I came across a short paragraph in a June 1945 report by the French security police, the DST. This recorded that a German farmer's wife had been found in Paris having somehow smuggled herself onto a train returning French deportees from camps in Germany. It transpired that she'd had an illicit affair with a French prisoner of war assigned to their farm in Germany while her husband was on the Eastern Front. She'd fallen so much in love with this enemy of her country that she'd followed him to Paris, where she was picked up by the police. Now, that was all the detail that was provided. And these few lines raised many questions. Would her difficult journey have been in vain, even if she'd not been picked up by the police? Had her lover given her the wrong address because he was already married? And had he returned home, as quite a few did, to find that his wife had had a baby in his absence by a German soldier? A recent book in France estimated that around 100,000 babies, known as enfants de guerre, or more viciously, bâtards de Boche, had been fathered by German soldiers during the occupation. Some put the figure even higher. In any case, the bare bones of the story could have almost been a novel by Marguerite Duras. It is, of course, a tiny tragedy in comparison to the horrors on the Eastern Front. But it remains a poignant reminder that the consequences of decisions by leaders such as Hitler and Stalin ripped apart the traditional fabric of existence. Many aspects are not as they appear on the surface, as I have learned over the years. I remember as a young officer in Germany during the Cold War, based next door to Belsen concentration camp, being horrified by a memorial to the French Jews who had died there. It stated, "Aux Juifs français qui sont morts pour la gloire de la patrie." I found the idea of French Jews dying for glory in the fatherland in such conditions quite grotesque. Many years later, I mentioned this to the French historian Henri Rousseau. He replied, "I entirely understand your reaction, but you're completely wrong. It was the French Jews themselves who insisted, after the war, that memorials to their dead should have exactly the same wording as those of all the other French. This was because they would never forgive Vichy for having tried to take away their French citizenship." Perhaps the hardest for us all of us to comprehend fully is the true experience of soldiers. The conditions under which men fought were so desperate that today we can hardly imagine how they endured them. Even many who were there look back with amazement. One Red Army officer, Vladimir Ivanovich Tulyanev, said, "Nowadays, I can't believe that we were able to live in the trenches, in the open, in the snow, never taking off our boots or clothes, with no water or source of heat. How on earth did we survive all that?" Between 1941 and 1945, some Red Army soldiers, those who survived the battles along the way, fought and marched for more than 7,000 miles. Red Army soldiers, afraid both of their Nazi enemy and of execution by their own side, were put under a terrible psychological pressure. They and Soviet civilians were crushed pitilessly between the two totalitarian regimes. Red Army snipers at Stalingrad, for example, were ordered to shoot down starving Russian orphans who'd been tempted with crusts of bread by German infantrymen to fill their water bottles in the river Volga. The proud brutality of Soviet commanders is simply unimaginable in Western democratic societies. When it came to ruthlessness, General Zhukov even exceeded his master Stalin. On the 4th of October 1941, Zhukov, as commander of the Leningrad front, issued the following order: to make clear to all troops that all families of those who surrendered to the enemy would be shot, and that they themselves would be shot upon return from prison. Ironically, it did not occur to Zhukov, when he issued this order, that under it, Stalin himself was in theory liable to execution, since his son Yakov Zhukashvili had recently surrendered. I don't think Stalin was unduly worried. He simply admired Zhukov for his pitiless determination. President Putin is always the first to claim that the Soviet Union won the Second World War in Europe. According to German sources, the Red Army inflicted just over 4 million fatal casualties on the Wehrmacht during the war on the Eastern Front, about 3/4 of the total Wehrmacht death toll. So the Soviet sacrifice and contribution to the destruction of Nazism was indeed the greatest. But at the same time, Putin refuses to acknowledge the American and also British contribution to Soviet survival and victory on the Eastern Front. The great myth encouraged under Stalin was that the British and Americans deliberately held back from launching the Second Front with a cross-channel invasion in order, this was, he said, they held back in order to weaken their communist ally. Putin still deliberately ignores the fact that even Stalin privately acknowledged that if the United States had not helped, we would not have won the war, as he said. Along with the vast supplies of weaponry, vehicles, fuel, and steel, came food supplies which saved the Soviet Union from famine, especially in the winter of 1942 to 1943. Red Army soldiers in their dugouts used to joke on opening an American tin of Spam, "Let's open the Second Front." Even today, few Russian historians are yet prepared to acknowledge that the hugely controversial Allied strategic bombing campaign against German cities helped the Soviet Union enormously. Whatever one might think about Air Chief Marshal Harris, known as Bomber Harris, his brutal and relentless bombing operations forced the Luftwaffe to withdraw the bulk of its fighter squadrons and anti-aircraft guns to defend the Reich. And this gave the Soviet Union air superiority on the Eastern Front for the first time. The 88mm anti-aircraft guns, which were also the Germans' most effective anti-tank guns, made a great difference in the ground war. The other important side effect of the Germans losing air superiority on the Eastern Front meant that they could not carry out air reconnaissance over the Red Army's rear areas. This enabled the Soviets to carry out major deception operations, which they called maskirovka, to conceal their major offensives, such as Operation Bagration, a surprise attack which secured Belarus and eastern Poland and destroyed the Wehrmacht's Army Group Center in the summer of 1944. Finally, there's one irony which Russian historians still refuse to acknowledge. If the United States had not provided 500,000 military vehicles to the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease, then the US Army would have reached Berlin well before the Red Army. Much has been written about the fighting qualities of the different armies in the Second World War, especially the difference between the armies of democracies and the armies of dictatorships. Much less has been said, on the other hand, about their similarities if one studies the performance of average as opposed to elite troops. The evidence indicates that only a small proportion of frontline troops truly engaged in combat. An initial study in the British Army was carried out in Italy in 1943 by Major Lionel Wigram. Wigram estimated that in most platoons of about 30 men, only a small handful really did the fighting. Another small group of men were likely to run away at the first opportunity. And those in the main group in between would follow the fighters if things went well and follow the runners if they went badly. General Montgomery was so horrified by the report that he had it suppressed and made sure that Wigram's career was ruined. The Germans, meanwhile, divided their soldiers' combat performances into 4 categories. So it's basically the same as Wigram's breakdown, except that the Germans split the main group in the middle in 2. The American combat historian, Brigadier S.L.A. Marshall, Slam Marshall, went into the subject in much greater detail soon after the war. There can be little doubt about the overall conclusion of his work, that only a minority of soldiers in a conscript army actually shoot at the enemy. The Red Army was no different. As we found out in the Russian archives, Soviet officers argued during the war that a weapons inspection should be carried out immediately after an engagement with the enemy. All those found to have clean barrels should be executed immediately as deserters. Previously unpublished letters and diaries of the time give us an idea of personal experiences, but they also reveal the attitudes and mentalities holding sway. German officers and soldiers, for example, felt that the Wehrmacht was invincible at the start of the war, which they were bringing so pitilessly to other countries. They never imagined that one day it might turn back against them and destroy their own homes and families. Their triumphalism in the conquest of France in 1940 was buoyed up by a relief that this war on the Western Front was completely unlike the battles of attrition in Flanders a generation earlier. "We live like gods in France," a German soldier wrote home. "If we need meat, we slaughter a cow and take only the best cuts. The rest is discarded. With our rifles in our hand, we then break into a house and our hunger is sated. Terrible, isn't it? But one gets used to anything. Thank God that these conditions don't prevail at home." The idea that the Führer had spared Germany such horrors, a typical confusion of cause and effect, became a constant refrain in soldiers' letters. Preparations for the massive assault on the Soviet Union prompted similar hopes of rapid victory. Forests of birch and fir along the Nazi-Soviet frontier concealed vehicle parks, tented headquarters and signal regiments, as well as fighting units. Officers briefed their men, reassuring them that it would take only 3 or 4 weeks to crush the Red Army. "Early tomorrow morning," wrote a soldier in a mountain division, "we're off, thanks be to God, against our mortal enemy, Bolshevism. For me, a real stone has fallen from my heart. Finally, this uncertainty is over, and one knows where one is. I am very optimistic, and I believe that if we can take all the land and raw materials up to the Urals, then Europe will be able to feed itself, and it will not matter how long the war at sea lasts." This war of annihilation, as Hitler called it, was pitiless. "The Russian is a tough opponent," wrote a German soldier. "We take hardly any prisoners and shoot them all instead." When marching forwards, German soldiers used to fire for fun at crowds of Red Army prisoners herded back to makeshift camps, where they were left to starve and freeze in the open. Thousands of Soviet citizens died in the bombing of the cities of Belarus. Survivors fared little better in their attempts to escape eastwards. "After Minsk began to burn," Vasily Grossman noted, "blind men from the Home for Invalids walked along the highway in a long line, tied to one another with towels." Beyond the repression and the starvation of ordinary Soviet citizens lay the far darker forces of Himmler's murderous SS squads, the Einsatz commandos. Only a few Jews managed to survive the killing pits, in some cases by digging themselves out from under the bodies on top of them. They were utterly traumatized. On the northeastern edge of Ukraine, Vasily Grossman encountered one of them, A girl, a Jewish beauty who'd managed to escape from the Germans, he wrote in his notebook, has bright, absolutely insane eyes. But the Germans were not invincible. In the autumn of 1942, they reached their cumulative point, which means that they had overextended themselves. They'd run out of momentum and were suddenly vulnerable. After the Soviet victory at Stalingrad that winter, the Wehrmacht's retreat began. Nervous breakdown became a much more open subject in letters home to Germany. Psychologically, wrote a gunner in a heavy artillery battery, I'm finding it increasingly hard to manage when you've just been having a good chat with a comrade and half an hour later you see him as little more than scraps of flesh, as if he'd never existed. This war is a crushing war of nerves. Soviet revenge for Nazi crimes in the East caused great fear. When, finally, in April 1945, the German front line began to break east of Berlin, traumatized survivors ran back shouting, "Der Ivan kommt." Local farmers and their families also started to flee. Refugees hurry by like creatures of the underworld, wrote a young soldier. Women, children, and old men surprised in their sleep, some only half-dressed. In their faces is despair and deadly fear. Crying children holding their mothers' hands look out at the world's destruction with shocked eyes. Some fathers, as they left to join their Volkssturm unit to defend Berlin, thought only of the fate awaiting their families. It's all over, my child, one told his daughter, handing her his pistol. Promise me that when the Russians come, you'll shoot yourself. He then kissed her and left. Others killed their wives and children and then committed suicide themselves. In the Far East, before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in Malaya, the racial arrogance of colonial society, British, Dutch, and French, had produced a dangerous self-deception. The British convinced themselves that all Japanese soldiers were very short-sighted and inherently inferior to Western troops. In fact, they were immeasurably tougher, far more mobile, and astonishingly self-sufficient. They did not need bridging equipment. Their soldiers cut thick bamboos, then threw themselves in pairs into the river and bent forward with the bamboos running from shoulder to shoulder in parallel to form a bridge for their comrades to run over. Japanese soldiers had been brought up in a militaristic society. The whole village or neighborhood would usually turn out to bid farewell to a conscript departing to join the army. Soldiers dreaded disgracing their family and community. And as many Japanese historians have pointed out, this actually was even more of a crucial factor than any ideas of wanting to die for glory or the emperor. Their basic training was designed to destroy individuality. Recruits were constantly insulted, slapped, and beaten by their sergeants and corporals to toughen them up. In what might be called the knock-on theory of oppression, this treatment was also intended to provoke them to take their anger out in turn on the soldiers and the civilians of a defeated enemy. During the rape of Nanking in December 1937, Japanese officers made Chinese prisoners kneel in rows, then practiced beheading them one by one with their samurai swords. Their soldiers were also ordered to carry out bayonet practice on thousands of Chinese prisoners bound or tied to trees. Any soldiers who refused were beaten severely by their NCOs. John Rabe, the German businessman from Siemens, who courageously organized a safety zone in Nanking, wrote in his diary, "I am totally puzzled by the conduct of the Japanese. On the one hand, they want to be recognized and treated as a great power on a level with European powers. On the other, they are currently displaying a crudity, brutality, and bestiality that bears no comparison except with the hordes of Genghis Khan." Japanese Navy pilots would sit down to play bridge together in what they considered a respectful imitation of British officers in the Royal Navy. But they would behead any shot-down American pilot pulled from the sea. Japan, in the 1930s, had become a dangerous combination of ancient culture and parvenu power. The Imperial Japanese Army's process of dehumanizing its troops was stepped up as soon as they arrived in China from the home islands. A Corporal Nakamura, who himself had been conscripted as a soldier against his will, described in his diary how they made some new recruits watch as they tortured 5 Japanese civilians to death. The newcomers were horrified, but Nakamura wrote, "All new recruits are like this, but soon they will be doing the same things themselves." I think that in the course of all my researches, the discovery that shocked me the most was the way that the Japanese military authorities did not merely condone, but actively encourage cannibalism, especially towards the end of the war. These were not isolated cases. A similar pattern was found across the Japanese army in China and Pacific garrisons who had been cut off from supplies by the strength of the US Navy. It became clear from all of the reports collected later by American authorities and the Australian War Crimes Section that cannibalism was a systematic and organized military strategy. Both local civilians and a number of Allied prisoners of war were kept alive as human cattle and then butchered for their meat one by one. On the 9th of May, 1945, when news of Germany's surrender reached the rifle companies of the American 1st Marine Division during the battle on the Japanese island of Okinawa, their reaction was, "So what?" They were exhausted and filthy, and everything around them stank. As far as they were concerned, the war in Europe was indeed another war on another planet. After the savage fighting on Okinawa, there remained the even more dreadful prospect of invading the Japanese home islands, where soldiers and 18 million civilians alike were preparing to fight to the death. None of the Marines knew then, of course, of the atomic bombs prepared in such secrecy. It was not just the nuclear age and the Cold War which began in 1945. The consequences of the Second World War reshaped the international order. They also brought world history together for the first time. This was partly because of the global reach of the conflict, but also because it sealed the fate of colonialism, the British, French, and Dutch empires. In the Far East, the defeat of the Japanese and the advance of the Red Army across northern China and Mongolia enabled Mao Zedong's Communist Party to win the Civil War and centralize the country in a totalitarian dictatorship. Although impossible to imagine at the time, this would enable China 7 decades later to become an economic and then military superpower. The origins of the Cold War lie, some say, in the Yalta Conference of February 1945. For Stalin, Poland was the key to Soviet security after the war, and he was determined that it should be kept entirely under his thumb. He had suffered a traumatic shock and humiliation on the 22nd of June 1941 when the German Wehrmacht invaded the Soviet Union without warning. His paranoid fear of surprise attack afterwards made him even more determined to create a cordon sanitaire of communist satellite states, centered on Poland and East Germany, and extending all the way from the Baltic down to the Black Sea. This was to make sure that this surprise attack could never happen again. On the other hand, the Yalta Conference also gave birth to the United Nations, which was inspired by President Roosevelt's belief in the possibility of a more peaceful world. In 1945, a war-ravaged Europe was left bankrupt and enfeebled. In fact, Western Europe might also have gone communist if it had not been for the Marshall Plan aid from the United States, which in 1948 kick-started economic recovery. The horrors of the conflict and its consequences spurred the start of a movement towards European Union. Yet European integration is a story both of the confusion of cause and effect and of the law of unintended consequences. It's long been an article of faith that the move towards unification has saved the continent from another war, but this idea is historically false. The real truth, of course, is that democracies do not fight each other. Peace is a question of governance, not unification. It is precisely the undermining of democracy which creates the conditions for conflict. And history has shown time and time again that attempts to suppress nationalism, in fact, make it far more virulent. Now, in the midst of alarming global instability, social, political, demographic, and economic, it is understandable that people look again at the Second World War as a warning, one that can perhaps alert us to danger signals. They might argue that we have learned little from history's greatest human tragedy and are blindly headed towards another global conflict. But history never repeats itself, and nothing in human affairs is inevitable. Yet we still need to understand the past to make better sense of what's happening around us now. And we must avoid the temptation to generalize or draw bogus parallels. The Second World War was a complex business, and our understanding of it must be equally nuanced. We tend, for example, to reduce the war to a battle between major powers. Some misleadingly portray it as a fight between democracy and dictatorship, even though the Soviet Union was certainly far from a democracy. In fact, the war was a conglomeration of different conflicts. Some were great power rivalries, yet all, to a certain degree, were influenced by the international civil war between the polarized extremes of communism and fascism. What we are seeing in Europe today, especially, is very different. The extreme left and extreme right, strongly assisted by Putin, are now linking up to undermine traditional parliamentary democracy. The sheer brutality of the Second World War is underlined by the fact that for the very first time in history, far more civilians were killed in a war than combatants. This can only be explained in terms of ideologically fueled dehumanization, nationalism stirred on to a fever pitch, and extolling racism as a virtue on one side, but also Leninist class warfare aiming to exterminate all opposition from the other. Not surprisingly, the Soviet Union fought tooth and nail in the United Nations committees after the war to prevent class warfare from being included in the international definition of genocide. The great Soviet physicist and dissident, Andrei Sakharov, observed that Stalin may have killed more people, but Hitler had to be defeated first. And he was, of course, quite right. If the Nazis had succeeded in defeating the Soviet Union, their so-called hunger plan to reduce the population through deliberate famine would have dwarfed even the horrors of the Holocaust. They aimed to wipe out at least 35 million people. Perhaps the Second World War's most important lesson is a moral one. Even in the midst of the most horrifying conditions, there were those who never let go of their fundamental belief in humanity. Their example is something we must try to uphold as we face the profoundly disturbing challenges and potential conflicts in the world today. It is striking that the Second World War as a subject still attracts so many novels, poems, and movies. But then no other period in history offers so rich a source for the study of moral choice, individual and mass tragedy, the corruption of power politics, ideological hypocrisy, the egomania of some commanders, betrayal, perversity, unbelievable sadism, but also self-sacrifice and unpredictable compassion. In short, one of the most important lessons of the Second World War is that it defies generalization and simple categories. Thank you very much. Now, we still have time for one or two questions, and if anybody has any questions, I will repeat it. Yes, Helen.
When you use that count of how many people were killed, did that include people that were killed in the concentration camps?
Yes, it did. The question was how many people were killed altogether, and whether the figure of 60 to 70 million included those who were killed in the concentration camps. There were many, of course, these figures, as one can imagine, are only estimates. But I think that despite the attempts of, say, Holocaust deniers, the figure is, even if it's not quite 6 million, is certainly reckoned to be well over 5 million, and pretty close to 6. So the figures really in the Soviet Union are very hard, particularly, to estimate accurately. At one time, the Russians were trying to say that even the loss in birth rate should be included in that total figure. But that, I think, would be, shall we say, a statistical distortion, to say the least. Yes, Mara?
You don't mention the British. And I was taught that thank God for the British.
Well, that's an interesting point. The question was, I didn't mention the British. The British played a certain part in the war. They did play a crucial part at a crucial moment. I think when one talks about the key turning points of the Second World War, the first key turning point actually came in late May 1940, because that was the one moment when Hitler could have won the whole of the Second World War. And this, I'm afraid, was treated very badly in a film recently called The Darkest Hour, because it was extremely inaccurate in the way that it tried to imply that Chamberlain had tried to plot against Churchill with Lord Halifax. This actually is totally untrue. In fact, it was the opposite. It was Chamberlain actually supported Churchill, who had behaved very well towards Chamberlain when he took over as Prime Minister. He said to Chamberlain, you must stay in 10 Downing Street, I will stay in the Admiralty and all the rest of it, and he treated him with great respect. The vital thing about this particular moment was that the British Army was cut off in France. It was before the so-called miracle of Dunkirk and the way that they were able to bring altogether 330,000 men back, which nobody had believed possible. And Halifax thought that the only chance of survival was to find out what terms Hitler might offer, and he wanted to start making peace negotiations via the Italians. And Churchill quite rightly realized that this would be the start of what he called the slippery slope, because the moment you even talk about talks, word would slip out at some particular point, and people would realize, and for example, the ability or the determination of the British to resist would have collapsed completely. And so Churchill was absolutely right there. He made a lot of other mistakes during the course of the war. Some of them we'll be discussing, I think, later on the subject of D-Day. Why was Churchill so opposed to D-Day and things like that? But we will always owe Churchill a huge debt purely for that extraordinary moment of courage and determination in May 1940. The actual geopolitical turning point of the war came a little bit later, and that was actually, of course, December 1941, when the Germans were blocked in front of Moscow, and when Hitler, for various reasons, mainly because of the submarine war, decided to declare war on the United States. It's amazing how people in Germany are always convinced that actually it was the United States which declared war on Germany. Simply not true. Roosevelt would never have been able to do that, but he could do it when the Germans had been suddenly provoked into this idea that if they used unrestricted submarine warfare on the east coast of the United States, they could perhaps bring Britain to its knees finally. But the actual psychological turning point of the Second World War was actually Stalingrad. This was the moment when Germans realized that they would never win the war, and in fact that the war would end in Berlin. And it's very striking the way that on the Reichstag, you still, and they've kept it, which I think is very admirable, the Germans have kept these graffiti scribbled by Soviet soldiers in 1945, all saying Stalingrad, Berlin. The two were completely linked in their minds. And we've got time for, I think, just one more before. Yes, sir.
Do you believe the economic sanctions that are being retaliated between the U.S. and China today could lead to a third world war that China could be planning now and might undertake in the next 3 to 5 years?
Question being, do we think that economic sanctions against China and other tensions or whatever could lead to a world war? I pray not. I think that, let's face it, the old idea really coming from Bismarck was, whatever you do, don't invade the Soviet Union or don't invade Russia. I think definitely today is don't take on China unless you really have to. At the same time, the way that China is behaving in such a provocative way, and especially in, if you like, projecting power by using debt, deliberately using debt on islands like Tonga or even in Argentina and places like that to secure naval bases around the world is deeply alarming. Before, people started to think that the Chinese empire was developing rather like the British Empire, i.e. it was a question of defending its infrastructure abroad. But actually it's gone way beyond that now that we see this deliberate attempt to take over naval bases, to try to cut off the South China Sea as a purely inland, almost Chinese lake. All of these things are really, I think, linked to the 19th century. And here I'm afraid Britain is largely responsible for the way that China was so humiliated in the 19th century with the Opium Wars and, of course, what the Chinese describe as the unequal treaties, i.e. forcing these treaties on China because it was so humiliated and weak at the time. Now, that is something that the Chinese have never forgiven and will never forgive. And as far as they're concerned, they are determined to have their day and take power. I'm sure that having talked to various generals, including General Ben Hodges last week on the subject of, if you like, the strategy that the United States can take in the present circumstances, it is alarming. And I mean, there's no doubt about it, that preparing for war with China is almost even more important than making sure that President Putin does not exploit the situation in Western Europe or Central Europe. And what we're seeing, of course, is actually, although there's been a lot about sort of President Trump making remarks against NATO, actually NATO is being quite strongly reinforced by the United States, because the one thing they don't want to have is, if there is conflict with China, Putin taking advantage from that in Europe. So, I mean, you're right to be concerned. And I remember a former American, not very long ago, former American chairman of the Joint Chiefs saying whenever he wakes up in the morning, his biggest fear is the South China Sea. And also, one might even add in the Taiwan Strait. So, yes, there's plenty to be concerned about in that particular way. I think I've run exactly to time. So, thank you very much indeed.